I have some specialist research on face masks and published some of the studies which have been used in guidance, used around the world for recommending face masks. So face masks are not perfect. We have air that leaks around the sides and even through the mask material. We know they're not perfect. At the same time, they can reduce the risk. So when you're walking in a shopping mall, even if it's a crowded area, if you're wearing a mask, you're much, much less likely to be exposed to any virus that's around. But if maybe your family member is an infected case and you're at home with them in a small flat, you spend hours together, even if you're all wearing masks, maybe with that kind of exposure, that kind of level of exposure, maybe the mask wouldn't be quite enough. And what we've seen in some of the studies that we've done in Hong Kong is that in households, even when people wear masks, it's difficult to prevent transmission because maybe there's so many opportunities. And we wear masks in the community when we're walking around, but when we sit down to eat, we take the mask off. When we're at home with our family, we often take them off. So while masks are important, we can't always rely on masks. Now, you asked specifically about spending time in a lift with other people and everybody's wearing masks. It could be very crowded. That's a very short space of time, so still the risk is going to be minimal, the risk of transmission. And I am not aware of a lot of outbreaks that have occurred in that kind of situation. The times when outbreaks have occurred is when people spend a longer time in close contact with each other, particularly if the place is crowded or if it's poorly ventilated. And so that's what we're trying to avoid as much as possible now in Hong Kong. We encourage people to wear masks in the general community because it's going to reduce the risk for everybody. But then at the same time, we've got to reduce crowding, we've got to reduce close contact in places where even if masks were worn, they'll have a limited effect just because of the intensity of exposure. Maybe the duration or the amount of virus that would be around is so great that the mask won't be perfect. The most research in masks has been done in surgical masks with 3 layers, and those are the most common type that you'll see around. There's relatively little research done on cloth masks, especially the type that a lot of people are wearing now in the COVID pandemic, and that's actually a major knowledge gap to be filled in the coming years by me or by other scientists who study masks to figure out what's the best materials, what's the best design. I don't know if you're aware, but in the US they now recommend wearing 2 masks instead of 1, and maybe when they've got through 2 masks they're going to think about wearing 3 or 4 or 5, but actually we could just design one mask that's better. Probably you can find a design that works better than just having 2 masks, because it seems like that's overkill. Maybe we'll have a better design in the future. And I can imagine having reusable cloth masks that are very cheap to make and can be distributed very, very widely if we need them in a future pandemic. Because we know there have been shortages in supply of surgical masks. Hong Kong was an excellent example of mask use in the community from a very early point in time. I still remember at the end of January, almost everybody in Hong Kong is wearing masks when they go out. At that point it was voluntary and everybody was already doing it, and then some months later the government made an announcement that it was mandatory to wear masks in public areas. And in other parts of the world we haven't seen that. It's been very controversial to recommend mask wearing for months and months, and then eventually most countries decided that they would recommend it or even require it. But it's been very controversial. I think in Hong Kong, the experience with SARS in 2003 made a big difference, because back in SARS, a lot of people did wear masks when they were worried about SARS. And then we have a culture ever since then of sick people wearing masks, and even vulnerable people who are not sick but want to protect themselves. Vulnerable people also wear masks. So we're aware of the concept. In schools, children wear masks if they've got respiratory symptoms quite often. And so it's really more of the culture here than maybe in other places that people understand the value of masks and are willing to wear masks. It's not unusual. Whereas in other countries, maybe they think it's a little bit unusual to wear a mask. I remember a year ago there was discrimination of Asians in European countries who wore masks because the Europeans hadn't seen it before. They didn't understand the need and the value of it.